Dorothy Whitmore, 54, had been standing in the hallway of Gerald Ashford's law office for 40 seconds before anyone acknowledged she existed. The receptionist looked up from her screen, clocked Dorothy's department store blazer and sensible shoes, and went back to typing without a word. Dorothy was used to being clocked and dismissed. She'd spent 6 years becoming invisible. She took a seat near the window and folded her hands in her lap. Through the glass, downtown Milwaukee rushed on indifferently. Delivery trucks, a woman pushing a stroller, pigeons working the sidewalk with their small, stupid urgency. Dorothy watched them and breathed slowly. She had gotten very good at breathing slowly. Walter Whitmore had died on a Tuesday, quietly, in the hospital bed that had taken over what used to be the dining room of his own house. Dorothy had been holding his hand. She'd held it through a great many things over the last 6 years. The Parkinson's diagnosis, the slow progression, the night he forgot her name, and called her by his first wife's instead. She hadn't corrected him. By then, names didn't matter much. Her husband, Frank, Walter's son, had died 4 years into it. A heart attack, sudden and without warning, which was the only mercy in it. She buried him on a Saturday and was back at Walter's side by Sunday, because there was no one else. Frank's older brother, Victor, sent flowers to the funeral. A large, expensive arrangement that arrived 2 hours after the service ended, with a card that read, "Thinking of you both." Walter's name was spelled wrong. She hadn't seen Victor in person in 14 months. Now she sat in his father's lawyer's office, waiting to hear what Walter had left her. The conference room smelled of leather, old paper, and someone's very good lunch. Gerald Ashford, 70, wore suspenders with the confidence of a man who'd earned the right. He set a thick folder on the mahogany table. Victor arrived 30 seconds later, his wife Sandra a step behind, her heels clicking a precise rhythm on the hardwood. Victor was 58, broad-shouldered, with the permanent tan of a man who vacationed often and felt no guilt about it. Sandra had the composed, sideways energy of someone always measuring a room. Neither of them greeted Dorothy. They simply sat. Gerald cleared his throat and read in the steady, unhurried tone of a man who'd delivered this exact kind of disappointment hundreds of times. Victor received the house. A 4-bedroom craftsman in Wauwatosa, Walter, had owned since 1971. He received the investment accounts, 2 decades of compounded patience, just over $2 million on paper. He received the vintage Buick in the garage, unstarted in 3 years, but kept washed on principle. Sandra received Walter's late wife's jewelry, a strand of pearls, a garnet brooch, a few other pieces with no value beyond age, and the fact that they'd belonged to someone gone. Dorothy received the contents of the basement storage room. Specifically, Gerald said, adjusting his glasses, the items listed in Addendum C, miscellaneous household objects Walter had asked be set aside for her. Victor made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, then converted it into a cough. Gerald reached under the table and produced a large canvas, wrapped loosely in a moving blanket and taped shut. He stood it against the table's edge. Dorothy stared at it, roughly 3 feet by 2 in a wooden frame warped at the bottom right corner. The canvas was dingy, not age-dingy, but grimy dingy, the kind of dirt that comes from decades beside a furnace. The paint had cracked in places, and someone had once touched up a corner in a burnt sienna that matched nothing around it. What image there was sat barely legible under the grime, a smear of blues and greys, maybe water, maybe sky, a dark shape that might have been a boat or a building or nothing at all. "That's it?" Dorothy asked. "That's the primary item, yes," Gerald said. "There are also 2 boxes of books, a set of mixing bowls, and a rocking chair with a broken spindle." Sandra regarded the painting the way you'd regard an unidentifiable smell in your own kitchen. "Walter bought that at a rummage sale in Kenosha," she said. "I remember it. $12. He thought it was charming." She said charming the way other people say delusional. Victor was already scrolling his phone. It was in the basement, Dorothy, next to the furnace. He set the phone down and looked at her, the first time since sitting, with an expression that was patient and a little performative. No hard feelings about any of this, I want you to know that. Dad made his wishes clear. You did a wonderful job with him. A pause. Dorothy looked at the painting. Is there something I need to sign? She asked Gerald. She carried the painting out to her 11-year-old Civic herself. The frame scraped her palm on the way in. She slid it across the back seat and sat behind the wheel a moment without starting the engine. The parking garage was dim and smelled of exhaust. She looked at her hands. They were hands that had done things, changed sheets, administered medications, learned to run a hospital-grade suction machine because the visiting nurse only came 3 times a week, and Walter needed it every day. Capable hands. Very tired hands. Her phone rang. Victor. She thought about not answering. She answered. Just wanted to make sure you got everything loaded okay, he said. Then no shift in tone at all. I also want to be straightforward with you about something. The painting. That was actually my idea. I suggested it to Dad maybe 2 years back when we were talking through his estate. Told him you'd appreciate something personal, something with meaning. He'd always had a sentimental attachment to it. A pause. I thought it was a kind gesture. Dorothy said nothing. The financial assets are significant, and managing them is going to get complicated. I'm sure you understand. You were Frank's wife, not a Whitmore by blood. Dad loved you, he really did. But these things have to be handled practically. His voice stayed smooth, reasonable, entirely at ease with itself. I hope there are no hard feelings. Dorothy hung up. She sat in the garage another full minute before she started the car. Her apartment was a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a Bayview building with good bones and a landlord slow to fix things. The kitchen window stuck. The radiator knocked. She'd moved in 8 months earlier. Once it was clear Walter's decline meant professional memory care, and the house needed to be preserved for whatever came next. 2 friends and a rented van, done in a weekend. She hadn't cried during the move. She'd cried later, in the shower, where it felt less like a choice. She propped the canvas against the kitchen wall and made a cup of coffee she never drank. She stood in front of it a long time. It was genuinely ugly. Not interestingly ugly, just dull and dirty, and seemingly without intention. The brushwork in the blue-grey section looked loose, almost impatient. The dark central shape was too heavy, threw off whatever balance the composition might once have had. The frame was worse than the canvas. Soft, poorly joined wood, a decorative edge once gilded and now flaking down to grey primer. But Victor had suggested it, had steered a dying man toward choosing it for her specifically. That fact sat in her chest like a stone. She wasn't angry the way she might have been at 30, hot, sudden. She was angry the cold, careful way of someone who has learned to be precise about what she feels. What she felt was this. She had given 6 years. Her 40s. The years after Frank. Years she might have spent building something of her own. And in exchange she'd been handed a dirty rummage sale painting a man had bought for $12 and forgotten in a basement. She also plainly needed the money. Her savings account held $847. Her credit cards carried balances from the years the visiting nurse cost came out of pocket, and her part-time remote bookkeeping didn't quite cover it. Her car needed new brake pads. She hadn't told anyone about the brake pads. She looked at the painting again. She found dish soap and an old cloth and, on some instinct she couldn't fully explain, wet the cloth and pressed it to the canvas's lower right corner, the section that looked least damaged. She worked gently, the way you clean something you're not sure can be cleaned. The water came away grey-brown. She went again, more carefully. The color underneath wasn't the grimy beige she'd expected. It was colder, more deliberate, a blue-green. She worked slowly along the lower edge. The grime was layered, some of it ordinary dust, some of it an actual overpainting, a thin wash applied deliberately long ago with a brush on top of the original surface. Beneath it, the loose, impatient brushwork resolved into something controlled. Short, precise strokes laid in a direction that caught the light differently depending on the angle. She stopped. Along the very bottom edge, mostly hidden by the warped frame, a thin strip of untouched original surface remained. Pressed into the paint rather than brushed on, she could make out 4 small marks. A stylized letter, 2 numerals, something like a dash or a flourish. The letter might have been a B or a D. A crack ran straight through it. She couldn't be sure. Dorothy stepped back. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, the November wind was doing something unpleasant to the kitchen window. She knew almost nothing about art. One college art history course, retained mostly as impressionists and not much else. She knew the Milwaukee Art Museum sat on the lakefront, 20 minutes away, and that it had a conservation department, because she'd read something about it once in the paper. She found the museum's website, read about the conservation department, and stared at the contact form for a while before filling it out. Then she wrapped the painting in a clean bedsheet, carried it down 3 flights of stairs, and drove to the museum, her brake pads doing what worn brake pads do. The conservation department's entrance sat around the back of the building, a plain door with a small sign. She'd called ahead from the parking lot. A woman named Jessie had told her to come in. Someone would take a look. Someone turned out to be Thomas Caldwell, 61, the museum's senior paintings conservator, rounded slightly in the shoulders from decades bent over things, deliberate in his movements, nitrile gloves already on, magnifying glasses pushed up on his forehead. He shook her hand and looked at the bundle she carried without expression. "Let's see what you've got," he said. The examination room was white and very bright. A large table under adjustable lighting, instruments Dorothy couldn't name, a wall of reference books. Thomas unwrapped the canvas with efficient, practiced hands, set it under the lights, and stepped back to study it the way you study a face, not a picture. "Where did it come from?" she told him. "Rummage sale, Kenosha, mid-1990s, basement storage, $12. He made a non-committal sound, brought the light closer, and leaned in, the area of grime, the overpainting, the exposed strip along the bottom edge. He picked up a loop. Dorothy watched him work. He had the stillness of a man who'd trained himself into it, the stillness of someone who's learned that hurrying causes damage. The loop moved slowly. Then it stopped. She saw his hand, resting on the table's edge, tighten, almost imperceptibly. He straightened, studied the exposed strip a long moment without the loop, then picked up a penlight and angled it low across the surface, raking the light to bring the buried brushwork into relief. He set the penlight down, crossed to a cabinet, and came back with a small glass bottle of solvent, a bundle of cotton swabs, and a second pair of gloves. "I'm going to clean a very small area," he said, "lower left corner, where the overpainting's thinnest. Completely reversible. Is that all right?" "Yes." He one swab, barely damp, on a space the size of a thumbnail. The overpainting lifted, not all at once, but enough. A second swab, a third. Dorothy couldn't see the result from where she stood. She watched his face instead. Thomas Caldwell had conserved paintings for 34 years. He'd worked on Flemish panels, on waterlogged Civil War portraits, on a Titian that had spent 40 years rolled in a tube. He had seen things come back from damage that looked permanent, and he had seen things that couldn't be saved. He had the face of a man who'd trained himself to receive information without letting it move him too soon. What Dorothy saw on that face now, in the 12 minutes she'd known him, she would never have predicted. He stopped breathing. Not dramatically, not for long. Just a pause. A gap in the ordinary rhythm of a body filling with something not quite ordinary. He exhaled slowly, set the swab down, leaned in closer, and gripped the table's edge. When he turned to face her, his eyes were wet. Not crying, not openly, but the brightness in them wasn't professional. It was the look of a man who has just seen something he had, somewhere deep and resigned in himself, stopped believing he would ever see. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was careful, like something carried a long distance. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to take it seriously." "Okay. How long has this painting been in your family?" "Walter, My father-in-law bought it around 1994, a rummage sale. And before that, do you know anything about where the sale was sourced from, whose estate it might have come out of? No, I only know what he told my husband, which wasn't much. He liked the colors, thought it might look good in the dining room. Ended up in the basement instead. She paused. Why? Thomas turned back to the canvas, held the loop over the cleaned patch. From where she stood, Dorothy still couldn't see clearly, but the light caught something. A color, a line, maybe a signature. What I'm looking at, he said slowly, is a priming style and a pigment combination I recognize. The way the lead white sits in the ground layer, this specific blue-green, it's a palette tied to a very particular period and place. He set the loop down. The overpainting on top is a period technique, applied deliberately, I believe, to obscure the original. This was done on purpose, and carefully, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Dorothy's heart was doing something she couldn't account for. Thomas crossed to the wall of books and pulled a large volume without hesitation, the reach of a man who'd gone to that same shelf many times. He laid it open on the table, away from the canvas, and found the page. The signature in the cleaned area has 2 characters I can read clearly, 2 more obscured by a paint crack. But those 2, combined with the style, the palette, the overpainting technique, there's one candidate that fits. He looked up. Are you familiar with the name Edouard Deschênes? She wasn't. He turned the book to a black and white photograph, a small painting hung in a museum gallery, a placard she couldn't read, water, sky, a dark mass at center. The composition was familiar, the weight was familiar. Deschênes was a minor figure in the post-impressionist period, Thomas said. French. Worked mainly in Normandy and Brittany in the 1890s and early 1900s. Sold to private collectors, not galleries, which is a large part of why he's considered minor. His surviving work is almost entirely unlocated. Something like 80% of his documented output has never resurfaced. He glanced at the canvas, then back at her. The working theory among specialists is that a good portion of it left France in the late 1930s, moved out by collectors protecting assets ahead of the war. Overpainted to disguise value, shipped out disguised as lesser goods. Dorothy found a stool near the table and sat without quite looking for it. This painting, his voice stayed controlled, but she could hear what was pressing against that control from underneath. If it's what I believe it is a Deschênes panel documented in a Paris private collection in 1931 and unaccounted for after 1938. The Art Loss Register has a record on it. So does the Wildenstein-Platner Institute. He paused. Specialists have been looking for this specific painting for over 60 years. The room went very quiet. Somewhere in the building, far off, a door closed. It needs full analysis, Thomas said. Infrared reflectography, X-ray, pigment sampling. I can't give you anything conclusive today, but I want to be honest about what I'm seeing, because you need to understand the situation you may be in. His eyes were still wet, still steady. If this authenticates, you're holding a painting worth, conservatively, at auction, given the documented loss history and the recovery story, somewhere between $8 and $14 million. Dorothy heard herself say, it was in the basement. Yes, Thomas said quietly, it was. She didn't remember the drive home. She remembered the parking garage, and then she was in her kitchen. And the painting was on the table, and she was sitting in the chair she always sat in, and the microwave clock read 4:47. She called no one that night. She sat with the painting, which she could now see. Now that she knew what to look for what it actually was, the dark central mass was a stone jetty. The blue-greens were harbor water under flat afternoon light. The loose brushwork wasn't impatience. It was a specific, controlled freedom that had been the whole point. Someone had stood on the Normandy coast more than a century ago, looked at a jetty in flat light, decided it was worth rendering, rendered it, signed it, and someone else had painted over that signature and sent it into the world to disappear. It had stayed invisible for 80 years, until Walter Whitmore paid $12 for it at a rummage sale in Kenosha because he liked the colors. She thought about Walter near the end, in the hospital bed in the dining room, on one of the clear days that came so rarely by then. He'd looked at her a long moment and said, "You know, Dottie, I always meant to get that painting looked at." "There's something about it," she'd said. "We'll do it when you're feeling better, Walter." They both knew they wouldn't. He'd squeezed her hand anyway. Thomas Caldwell called the next morning at 9:15. "I spent last night going through the archival documentation," he said. "I'd like to bring in a colleague from Provenance Research. And I'd like to start the technical analysis as soon as you're willing to authorize it. The museum works with the Art Loss Register. We can move on this quickly if you want to." "Yes," Dorothy said, "please." "One more thing," he added. "I made a few discreet calls this morning just to triangulate my read. A colleague in Chicago, a provenance specialist at the Art Institute, confirmed the pigment analysis fits my hypothesis." She got a brief pause. "Quite emotional, actually, when I described the signature. She's been writing about the Deschaines' dispersal for 15 years. Dorothy thanked him and hung up. She was still staring at the painting when the phone rang again. Victor. She let it ring. It rang twice more that hour. Then a text arrived. "Dorothy, I've heard you took that painting to a museum. I think we should talk. There may be questions about what's properly part of the estate." She showed the text to her attorney. She'd called one that morning, a woman named Patricia Osey, an estate litigator with a reputation for a precision that made other lawyers uncomfortable. Patricia read it and said, "Good, let him raise it." Victor did, 4 days later, through Gerald Ashford. A formal letter arguing that the painting, as a household object of potential value, might belong properly to the estate inventory rather than to Addendum C, and that as executor he had standing to request its return pending review. Patricia's response went out within 24 hours. Dorothy would later describe it as the legal equivalent of a very cold look. The will was explicit. Dorothy received the contents of the basement storage room. The painting had been stored in the basement storage room. Walter's estate attorney, not Gerald, but the woman who'd actually drafted the will, Carol Dempsey, 72 and not fond of being contacted unexpectedly, confirmed on record that Walter had specifically designated the basement storage contents as Dorothy's bequest, documented 18 months before his death, while he still had full legal capacity. Victor withdrew the challenge 11 days later. Authentication took 4 months. Dorothy spent them in her Bayview apartment, working her bookkeeping clients, fixing the kitchen window herself, with weather stripping from the hardware store, and visiting the museum twice a week to see Thomas, who walked her through each stage with the careful thoroughness of a man who understood she needed to understand it. He showed her the infrared images, the underdrawing consistent with the documented style. He showed her the X-ray, a compositional sketch matching one archived in a Paris gallery's 1903 records. He explained the pigment analysis and what it meant. The day the formal authentication report was finalized, Thomas called her into the examination room and set it beside the painting. Partially cleaned now, the overpainting removed piece by piece over weeks of his own patient work. The jetty stood in harbor water. The light was flat and gray and true. It wasn't a grand painting. It was a quiet one, made by someone who had stood in a specific place at a specific hour and looked carefully at what was there. Thomas shook her hand. His eyes were wet again. "Congratulations," he said, "for what it's worth. Beyond the money, beyond the auction estimate. This is a genuine recovery. 60 years. People who study this period of French painting are going to be writing about it for a long time." Sotheby's New York estimated the Deschaines harbor panel between $9 and $13 million, with the sale scheduled for the following spring. The evening the estimate went public, Patricia called to tell Dorothy that Victor had gone back to Gerald with a new angle, that Dorothy, as a caregiver rather than a blood relative, had held a position of inappropriate influence over Walter in his final years, and that the basement bequest might be contestable on those grounds. Patricia also told her what she'd found reviewing the estate's actual finances. The investment accounts Victor had inherited, the $2 million on paper, were substantially leveraged. In his final years managing them, Walter had borrowed against the portfolio to cover losses he'd never disclosed. After the loans were settled, the accounts were worth closer to $400,000. The Wauwatosa house carried a home equity line drawn nearly to its limit. The vintage Buick needed an engine rebuild. He got exactly what he asked for, Patricia said. Dorothy was quiet a moment. He saw a number on a page, she said finally. He never asked what was underneath it. The undue influence claim was withdrawn before it was ever formally filed. Victor didn't contact her again. On the last Sunday in March, Dorothy drove to the lakefront and sat on a bench facing Lake Michigan. Cold out, the water gray-green and choppy, almost no one else around. She'd brought coffee in a paper cup and sat with it, watching the water. She'd kept one thing from the whole affair, not the painting itself, which would go to auction and to whoever stewarded it next, but a photograph Thomas had taken during cleaning, the signature legible for the first time in 80 years. She'd had it framed. It hung in her kitchen now, above the window she'd fixed herself. She thought about Walter saying, "There's something about it." About the fact that he'd carried it out of a rummage sale in Kenosha and hung it in his dining room and eventually banished it to the basement, but never once thrown it away. She thought about the careful person, a century earlier, who had painted over someone's harbor scene, crated it, and hoped it would survive long enough to be found again. She finished her coffee and walked back to the car. The brake pads, at least, had been replaced. If someone handed you a box of someone else's discards and told you it was worthless, would you look closer? Or take their word for it? The people who decide what's worth keeping and what isn't are often wrong. They're wrong in the most expensive ways possible, and they're usually the last ones to know it. If this story stayed with you, hit like and share it with someone who needs to hear that what gets overlooked isn't always what's worthless. Subscribe to Inherit Her Drama. We're back every week with stories about the things people leave behind and the people who learn what they were really worth.